This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company this morning. Joining me now, Labor MP Ed Husic and Liberal MP Jamie Briggs. Gents, good to see you both. Jamie, let's look at the states first of all. Cuts in Queensland and New South Wales. Barry O'Farrell apparently intervened to stop cuts happening for independent and Catholic schools. That's going to placate some of your colleagues, isn't it?
Well, look, I think there was some concern amongst some of our colleagues about the process that the State Education Minister had gone through in New South Wales, and obviously Barry had worked through that, but the details you'd have to talk to Barry O'Farrell and my state colleagues in New South Wales about that. But there's a really important point here, which is this, that state Labor governments for too long spent more money than what they were taking and spent themselves into massive debt, massive deficit. Interestingly, in Canberra, we've got a government that's spent us into nearly $300 billion worth of debt. They've got a $120 billion black hole. Last week, and Tanya Plibersek, the health minister, was just on when she made her announcement with the Greens, the Greens dental care announcement that the Labor Party's adopted. She was asked, how are you going to pay for this? And Tanya Plibersek's answer was really telling when she said, oh, we'll tell you that later. Now, that is the reason Campbell Newman, Barry O'Farrell, Ted Baillieu, Colin Barnett have had to go through really difficult budgets, make really hard decisions, because state Labor governments have spent too much money for too long, and their federal brothers and sisters are doing exactly the same thing, spending us into massive debt and deficit.
Well, Wayne Swan does argue that to get to the surplus, for example, if you do say, I know that you're going to dispute what Jamie has put there, but what he's arguing is that the government needs to show fiscal discipline federally. Why can you be so critical of the states for doing what you're preaching federally?
Easy, because we, at 2 points through the year, have to show our position in relation to our spend and in terms of spend and revenue. We do it through the budget, we do it through MyEFO. We're upfront about it. If, say, for example, taking on board what Jamie said, if the coalition opposition parties say, when we get in, we're going to have to make some tough choices, and we do it, you're not going to like it, but you understand where they're coming from. Both in terms of Queensland and New South Wales, and particularly in New South Wales, there was never any suggestion that there would be cuts to school funding, lifting TAFE fees, cutting jobs. Here we are talking on the one hand about through Gonski, trying to ensure that we get improved teacher quality in terms of to improve student outcomes and finding a way to fund this and working with state governments on it. And then you have this happen. And, you know, from the New South Wales perspective, the killer point is this. What's getting me is that you're seeing cuts to education funding, but at the same time, the New South Wales government is committing to spending huge amounts of money on North West Rail.
It's actually, well, my issue is, though, it's a cap on the funding.
Well,
it's a cap on the funding. They're not actually cutting it.
Talk to the schools that have to deal with growth. Talk to the schools that have to deal with change spending priorities, and then explain to them why the money is leaving schools to fund the North West Rail link system in New South Wales in one city in New South Wales.
Well, I think that was a point that one of the Liberal MPs suggested. But Jamie Briggs, are you worried that the backlash against some of these states for making hard decisions, and say that we take your argument at face value that they're cleaning up the budgetary mess, even if they are doing that, there's going to be a political pain, isn't there? Are you worried that flows through federally?
Well, it's not my argument, it's the facts. The state Labor governments spent too much money for too long, spent states into massive debt, and the federal government's done the same thing, $120 billion black hole on top of their $300 billion debt.
Doesn't help Tony Abbott, though, as you know, this Gonski debate's happening, that these cuts are being
Well, the government's
implemented.
making unfunded announcements, that's the point. Gonski, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the Greens dental health policy, which the government's adopted, these policies are not funded. They are just pie-in-the-sky ideas. The disability insurance scheme's a terrific idea, and we think it's a great idea, but we don't think you should be misleading people without the funding.
On the politics, are you worried that it's going to hurt the coalition federally, the backlash against what we're seeing already in Queensland, for example? Campbell Newman has copped a fair bit of flack already in the polls?
Well, ultimately, people are very critical of politicians for not standing what they believe in. Campbell Newman and Barry O'Farrell said that they would fix the budget messes. Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey have said we'll fix the budget messes. We will be very clear before the election about our priorities. Ultimately, government is about choices, and the choices for the Labor Party is always more bureaucrats, more spending, more uncosted announcements. The spending for the priorities for Conservative governments is always to ensure that you will live within your means, to take pressure off the cost of living pressures for ordinary Australians who go about their daily. But they know in their own households that they've got to manage their budget within their own means. It's a pity Labor governments don't.
But at the same time, too, every time they say, every time the
one of your colleagues, though, I just want to just point out that the Labor minister in Queensland said that it was a bloated bureaucracy. I put the same point to Tanya Plibersek. Labor conceded that the bureaucracy was bloated in the health department. In Queensland.
In Queensland, well, look, they'd actually said before the election there were a number of reforms that Anna Bligh was taking to change the way that health worked in Queensland. But let me get to the other point that I did want to make. I mean, it's one thing for you to lecture financial rectitude and say to us that we should live within our means.
Absolutely.
But whenever we go to take saves through the budget, they're opposed every step of the way by the federal coalition. So you can't say on the one hand, save money, make tough cuts. We go to make them, you don't support them. And that's the problem. And so well, we've had like the whole process in the aftermath of the budget. I mean, look at private health. Like we're trying to better target the way we spend money, opposed by you guys.
No.
So the issue. Oh well, see, there you go. So what happens? So what about mums and dads who send their kids to public schools? They got aspirations for their kids. They don't want to see their funds cut to public schools or independent schools. And I don't know how many federal MPs from the coalition side I've seen going on about they're worried about funding to Catholic and independent schools. Well, I'd like to see them now stand up for those very schools in New South Wales.
All right, let's move on to the super trawler now. Some doubts over whether the government's going to secure the numbers it needs. Ed Husic, Rob Oakeshott, as we heard on the program a bit earlier, dubious about the science about the decision and the science underpinning Tony Burke's decision.
Well, it'll be interesting to see whether or not the coalition supports fishing communities in southern Australia, and particularly those communities in Tasmania that have said that they are concerned about the impact of the super trawler on fish stocks and bycatch, and the impact on bycatch as a result of dolphins, seals, and others being caught up in that trawler that's using nets that I've been told are as big as the Sydney Cricket Ground. So what we're trying to do, what Tony Burke has said he wants to do, is ensure that the expert panel's in place to be able to look at something, the dimensions of the super trawler and its impact.
Reaction.
Well, he has said, actually sought weeks ago for legal advice about the breadth of his powers to deal with something like this. So, if the coalition is equally concerned as we are about the impact on fishing communities, we'd hope that they'd support what we're trying to do.
I think one of your colleagues, the Shadow Minister from Tasmania, if I'm right, is worried about the sovereign risk element of this.
Well, and rightly. I mean, this is just live cattle exports all over again. Get Up and the Greens campaign, the Labor Party backflips. Because if the Labor Party was really concerned about this process, they would have announced that months ago, because it's been months now that the super trawler was coming to Australia. It wasn't a secret that it was heading here. There'd been a process underway for some time. Now, there's a really important point here, which is this. I've got a lot of fishing communities in my electorate, and people have been raising issues, but the point is simply this. If the government believes in the science of climate change, and they say if you don't accept the science of climate change, you're some sort of denier, then when it comes to this issue, when they're under pressure from the Get Up and the Greens, they just completely whack the science away, ignore the science and go to their own populist position. There's a big inconsistency here.
One of the ANU experts last night on the ABC, I think it was, said that the bigger boat is actually better environmentally because it can go further out and not deplete stocks as much. So the science, according to many, would suggest that the bigger boat
including the Joe Ludwig.
Is preferable.
2 days ago in the Senate, Joe Ludwig said the science is very clear here. So what has happened in those 24 hours?
We're going to take on board, as Tony Burke, as Minister Burke has said, like the establishment of the expert panel to actually get a clear sense of the facts. And I'd be very careful. A lot of coalition MPs, I know it's part of the talking points for them, they've got this thing about this is a response to Greens and Get Up. If I was someone in Tasmania in a fishing community or in the fishing communities you represent that heard that, I'd be very careful about being so dismissive about their concerns.
I'm not dismissive at all, Ed. My simple point is, and I've engaged, I've spoken to some scientists about this because there has been people who have raised this issue with me and my electorate, and I've said the science says, and I've sent them the paper that the government relied on by one of the most world-renowned scientists, that this is an appropriate way within a quota. It is an appropriate way to deal with this issue, and so that's what the government thought for a number of weeks too. So if you're an international investor looking at Australia right now, you've seen 2 years. Well, we're going to consider what's in the bill, obviously, and we'll have a discussion this morning. We don't just take knee-jerk reactions based on an internet campaign by a mob who's purely out there trying to make their own environmental political goals at the expense of Australia's sovereign risk, at the expense of good science and good policy.
All right, gents, we're out of time. Ed Husic and Jamie Briggs, have a good day.
Thank you.
Good to see you both. That's all for AIM Agenda. The news is next.